The village of St. Mary Mead was at its most charming in early June, when the roses clambered over every gatepost and the vicarage lawn smelled faintly of fresh scones and honeysuckle. On this particular Saturday, the annual charity garden fete was in full swing, a highlight of the village's social calendar and, as Miss Marple often observed, a most revealing occasion for human nature. Tables were laden with Victoria sponges, local jams, and knitted tea cozies. The vicar's wife presided over the tombola with nervous energy, while Major Withers grumbled about the price of the raffle tickets. There were children chasing hoops, ladies gossiping over lemonade, and more than one gentleman sneaking an extra glass of cider behind the marquee. Miss Jane Marple, delicate and unassuming in her pale lavender hat, sat quietly beneath an elm tree, knitting a shawl for the church bazaar and listening, always listening. Her sharp blue eyes missed nothing, not the anxious flutter of Mrs. Phelps's hands as she avoided a question about her husband's new secretary, nor the peculiar stiffness between young Leonard Briggs and Miss Daphne Worsley, who until recently had been inseparable. Just before dusk, as the fete drew to its sleepy close, a sudden commotion rippled through the crowd. From the direction of Elm Street, a narrow lane that led past the vicarage and the old Cooper residence, came the unmistakable sound of breaking glass, followed by a woman's scream. For a brief moment, the laughter and chatter ceased entirely. Then came the vicar's urgent voice. "Good heavens, what on earth was that?" Miss Marple rose, her knitting forgotten. "It sounded," she said quietly, "as though something unfortunate has occurred. Perhaps we should investigate, though I dare say it will be nothing. Terribly ordinary things often are." The crowd gathered like moths toward the disturbance, their curiosity outweighing their fear. The lane was dim, the tall elms casting long, uneasy shadows. At the far end, the light from a cottage window flickered uncertainly. The door to number 7 Elm Street, the home of Mrs. Agnes Cooper, a widow of 63 and known for her sharp tongue, stood ajar. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of spilled ink and something metallic. Mrs. Cooper lay slumped over her writing desk, one hand still clutching a pen. Her spectacles were crooked, her teacup shattered beside her, and on the floor by her chair, a single calling card gleamed in the lamplight. It bore no name, only a black silhouette of an old-fashioned telephone. "The midnight caller," murmured someone behind Miss Marple. The phrase caught like a chill in the air. Miss Marple stepped forward gently, her eyes sweeping the scene. Her voice, soft as ever, carried a strange weight when she spoke. "I think," she said, "we may have witnessed the beginning of something rather dreadful. You see, people rarely die while writing letters, unless there's something they urgently wish to say." Morning in St. Mary Mead arrived with a pall of quiet that the sun could not quite shake, though it tried valiantly, touching the cottage eaves with warm gold and making the hollyhocks look especially pert. Yet the village itself moved as if in a dream, slower, careful, whispering. The bell of the grocer's door jangled too loudly. The postmistress answered greetings with a sober tilt of the head. Where there is usually the comforting racket of errands and errands postponed, there was that curious hush people cultivate when they are listening for news and supplying it themselves in the same breath. Miss Marple, who rarely found herself in a hurry and never without purpose, walked to the high street with the small neatness of a sparrow. She stopped to admire the white roses tumbling over Mrs. Price Ridley's low wall and, as if the roses required it, mentioned that they were at their best for the first post. No, perhaps the second. Mrs. Price Ridley came out in her gardening gloves, her voice already solemn with the importance of events. "They say she had taken to writing letters late at night," said Mrs. Price Ridley, tapping soil from an index finger. "Agnes Cooper, nerves, the widow's temperament. It puts one into a sort of theatrical state." "So unfortunate," Miss Marple said gently. "I always thought Mrs. Cooper's temper belonged to the daylight." "Well," returned Mrs. Price Ridley, You never saw her after committee meetings, a perfect harpy, and I am told that there was a card, wasn't there, was found by her chair. Black as sin, the midnight caller, pure melodrama. These things don't happen unless somebody encourages them. I dare say she had been persecuting someone with letters. Or, Miss Marple observed, perhaps someone imagined that she had. At the post office, the talk had already grown more elaborate. Mr. Phelps was in the corner, muttering about stamps and the outrageous price of them, but his wife's new secretary, a tidy young woman with lemon-colored hair and the perpetually composed face of those who must be composed for someone else's sake, was decidedly the subject of several glances. Miss Hartnell, halfway between paying for her telegram and deciding upon another telegram entirely, leaned in toward the grill. "Anonymous calls," Miss Hartnell murmured with relish. "They had them in Eastbourne. Start with a little ring at midnight, and before you know where you are, death enters the scene. It's practically an inevitability. Agnes Cooper was the sort to invite a nuisance by standing up to it." Agnes, said Mr. Phelps from his corner, made it her life's duty to stand up to everything, including the vicar's hymn choices. She told him last week he was making the congregation drowsy. "She did not suffer fools," the postmistress added, stamping a parcel with a thump that felt like a punctuation mark. "Or those who used other people's driveways. Mrs. Cooper had a dreadful quarrel only yesterday with Major Withers about his motor car. Parked across her garden gate, so she said." Miss Marple's expression was pleasant and mildly curious. "Major Withers is not usually untidy about his car," she murmured. "He keeps the hood polished so carefully." "Precisely," said Miss Hartnell, pleased, which shows he was otherwise occupied. And though one hates to point, the Major had a debt at the grocer's that Agnes, quite needlessly in my opinion, mentioned at the last Fete Committee meeting. Men do not like their little economies exposed. It unmakes them. Miss Marple thanked the postmistress for a packet of needles, inquired whether the afternoon delivery would be timely, and departed with the air of one who collects rainwater in a china saucer and finds it perfectly sufficient. On the lane she paused, where the elms drooped over Elm Street like a row of listening ladies, and thought of spilled ink, crooked spectacles, and a pen still in a tightening hand. "People rarely die in the midst of sentences," she had said last night. It was a true observation, though there were exceptions, of course, and exceptions, to be useful, had to be properly understood. Number 7 was shuttered and under the watch of a constable with the kindly awkwardness of a man who prefers files to people. He touched his cap when Miss Marple approached. "Inspector Slack from County's in there, ma'am, and Dr. Haydock came first thing, he did." A faint pride illuminated his words, as though the village had turned out its best silver in an emergency. "I shan't intrude," said Miss Marple, which, for her, meant she would intrude so gently that the house should hardly notice. She pared along the garden, noting the path of crushed time, a hinge that had been newly oiled, and the faint mark where the postman's bicycle had leaned. One need not count footprints when one knew feet well enough. The village supplied all the walking one required to have the measure of a gait. Inspector Slack emerged onto the step at that moment, precise and slightly harried, as if mystery were an unseemly mess others had made of his tidy schedule. He had improved with time. Professionals do, once they have been taught not to ignore crochet and tea parties as sources of information, but he retained a flattering disbelief in Miss Marple's method. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, firm and brisk. "You've heard?" "One cannot help it," Miss Marple replied. "St. Mary Mead is a great gatherer of morsels. I only wondered whether there had been any telephone calls of note. The card last night, so striking. Some sort of sick joke." Slack's jaw hardened. No sign of a telephone in the house being used at the time, and Mrs. Cooper appears to have suffered a blow. Back of the head. Candle holder, brass, no burglary. Purse on the mantel, and nothing disturbed but the ink. She was writing. The page is blotted. We'll see if we can make anything of it. "People do blot when they are interrupted," Miss Marple said mildly, "and sometimes when they are frightened." We're looking at her circle. She offended plenty. Major Withers, yes. The Phelpsies, for some reason I haven't got to the bottom of. And there's this youngster, Leonard Briggs, Rowe, with his girl, Miss Worsley. Mrs. Cooper saw them quarrelling last week, and apparently enjoyed herself describing it to anyone who couldn't escape quickly enough. The girl's father is a respectable man, and the boy looks like he might work hard at something when he remembers what it is. Leonard is devoted to his mother, Miss Marple said, which is the sort of devotion that has a way of becoming unwieldy. He would not like the word pitiable applied to him, and young men can be provoked by the fear of pity. Slack eyed her. I don't intend to build a case out of pity. No, agreed Miss Marple, but you might prevent one from being built out of resentment. They are so much alike to look at. He grunted. Dr. Haydock wants me to keep the scene closed till after luncheon. We'll have statements in the afternoon. You'll let me know if you hear anything useful. Oh, Inspector, Miss Marple said with the smallest incline of the head. Everything one hears is useful if one knows what sort of drawer it belongs in. She walked back along Elm Street, and at its end encountered Daphne Worsley herself, pale as if the sun were no better than chalk. The girl's gloved hands twisted each other uncomfortably. Miss Marple, do you think they'll ask everyone where they were? It's only Father doesn't like questions in the house. They will ask, Miss Marple said, kind and steady. And people will answer. It is often more comfortable than one imagines beforehand. Daphne's eyes shone with the miserable courage of the very young. Leonard was with friends last night, he said. He said not to worry, but I do. Then put your worry in a useful place, Miss Marple advised. Tell me, did Mrs. Cooper have callers in the evenings, besides the usual neighbors? A gentleman came twice this week, Daphne said after a fraught pause. Not a villager, tall, city clothes. He had the air of a person who listens to himself talk. Mrs. Cooper called him Mr. something short. Mr. Pike? No, Pike-like. Pike-like can be very suggestive, Miss Marple murmured. Thank you, my dear. I should not brood on Leonard. Young men tell themselves stories when they are humiliated, but they rarely choose midnight to settle them in a stranger's drawing room, unless they have been invited there. Invited. The word lingered with her as she walked on. Invited could be coaxed by threat as well as courtesy. Invited could mean summoned, could mean called. The brass, candle holder, the blotted page, the delicate violence of a blow from behind. These looked one way, but the village's talk, when sifted for its small grit of truth, drifted another. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Cooper's habit of straightening frames and correcting the vicar's hymns, of a personality that fancied control and had lately, perhaps, delighted in the control of secrets. Near the green, Major Withers was lecturing the chemist about proper valve maintenance, with more heat than valves deserved. Young Leonard, passing by, avoided the Major's eye and nearly collided with Mr. Phelps' lemon-haired secretary, who apologized with excessive care, as if every word had to be accounted for. Miss Marple saw it all from a distance, as if the village were arranging itself into a little tableau. The offended, the anxious, the careful, the proud. It is the lovely thing about a small place. Everything shows if one is patient. And where everything shows, the thing one must watch for is what insists on remaining unseen. She thought then, very specifically, of the card on the floor with its silhouette of a telephone, old-fashioned with the separate earpiece and the mouthpiece like a tiny black trumpet. An old-fashioned device for summoning attention, a little theatrical. St. Mary Mead disliked theatricals, and so when theatricals arrived, they covered their nervousness with theory. That, too, was useful to know. By afternoon, statements would be taken and positions advanced like chess pieces. Before that, there was time to sit in her parlor with the lavender hat laid aside and the knitting on her lap, and remember 3 instances, one in the curate's family and 2 in cottages farther out, where a showy explanation had been used as a screen for something rather drably practical. She tied off a row, listened to the faint chime of the church clock, and felt the next stitch forming smoothly in her fingers. Somewhere behind an appearance, theatrical and black and badly chosen, someone had hoped to make a dull action look exciting. And those people, in Miss Marple's experience, were almost always the sort who could not bear to be contradicted. After luncheon, the village gathered its courage under the faint promise of afternoon sun. Conversation, which had hovered in doorways and at gates, now trickled toward the green where a few villagers pretended to concern themselves with errands that placed them conveniently near Elm Street. Miss Marple, having allowed the first gust of speculation to blow past her window, took her customary walk just as Inspector Slack's motor car came to a halt before number 7. She moved slowly enough to be mistaken for aimless, but her eyes were alert. The constable had gone, leaving a sense that the house itself held its breath. Inside, Slack's voice carried with an impatience that was almost familiar to her by now. A man convinced that logic must sound brisk. "We've taken statements," he was saying. "Withers admits to an argument about the motor car, but claims he left her doorstep by 7. The Phelps woman's secretary insists she was home writing letters. The boy, Briggs, spent the evening with friends until 11:30. They'll all stand by that, of course." Dr. Haydock, pipe in hand, nodded toward the desk. No sign of poison. A clean blow delivered from behind. A heavy hand, but not necessarily a strong one. "I should say the murderer was close enough to know her habits. She wrote late, as we've heard." "Or was made to appear so," said Miss Marple, stepping softly into the room as though invited. "One can write letters at any hour if one wishes to create the impression of surprise." Slack sighed, though not rudely. "Ah, Miss Marple, I thought I might find you hovering near the facts. You've a remarkable sense for them, I'll give you that." "I find facts have a way of standing very still," she said. "People, on the other hand, move about quite nervously." The inspector gestured toward the desk. The letter she was writing, half a page, ink blotted, as you noticed. "My dear," and that's all. No name yet, but there's another sheet underneath, folded, already written and sealed. No address, no stamp. We're sending it to the lab. "How intriguing," murmured Miss Marple. "A letter meant to be found, perhaps, and another meant to disappear. People who quarrel often leave behind just such a confusion." Dr. Haydock looked at her keenly. "You think this wasn't simple housebreaking?" "Burglars seldom bring calling cards," she said, "and they rarely tidy the ink bottle afterward." The doctor blinked. "Tidy?" She pointed delicately to the rim. "Not a drop on the surface. Someone wiped it clean after the splash. One imagines the person disliked disorder." Slack frowned, his pencil stilling. "Now that you mention it, the surface is too neat. We'd assumed she knocked it over as she fell." "Possibly," Miss Marple allowed. But Mrs. Cooper's nature was corrective, not careless. Even in distress, she would have rescued her stationery before herself. Dr. Haydock chuckled. "You'll have us believing murderers care about blotting paper." "Sometimes," she replied, "they care about far less sensible things." Slack cleared his throat. "We'll keep that in mind. Meanwhile, we've a statement from the postmistress. Mrs. Cooper had received a letter 2 days ago from London. Handwritten envelope, no return. Postmark smudged. She told the postmistress she recognized the handwriting and was pleased to hear from an old acquaintance." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Ah, old acquaintances are often the most inconvenient correspondents." She wouldn't say who, Slack continued, "but it seems this acquaintance might have called on her later that day. That matches the description Miss Worsley gave you, doesn't it?" "Tall. Gentleman," Miss Marple confirmed, with a self-satisfied air. "Mr. Pike, or something that sounded like it." Slack flipped a page in his notebook. "No one by that name in the parish. We'll ask the London police to look into the letters. Until then, we've the locals. Between you and me, the Major's nerves are showing. We'll press him again." Miss Marple's smile was faint but not dismissive. Men like Major Withers are never so unhappy as when they are innocent. They overplay it dreadfully. Leaving the inspector to his notes, she walked back into the afternoon. The village air was thicker now, filled with whispered accusations. Miss Hartnell stood outside the grocer's, expounding to a small crowd that murder always began with extravagance. "And Agnes Cooper never could resist showing she had a shilling more than you," she declared. "Why, that new tea service, gold rims, they say, vulgar, really." Leonard Briggs passed by just then, his shoulders stiff, his collar undone as if the morning's questions had left their mark. "She wasn't vulgar," he muttered, loud enough for them to hear. "She just said what she thought." Miss Hartnell's brows lifted. "And that was precisely the trouble, my dear boy." Miss Marple turned slightly, watching him go. He did not notice her. He moved with a restless urgency, the kind that belongs to those who fear they have been seen doing something or not doing enough. She followed the lane toward the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement met her at the gate, cheeks flushed with restrained excitement. "Jane, you've heard the latest? They say Mrs. Cooper's maid, that timid little Elsie, has disappeared." Disappeared. Left early this morning before the inspector arrived. Packed her things and told no one. Her cousin in Much Benham claimed she was frightened of something, wouldn't say what. Miss Marple's knitting bag swung gently at her side. "Frightened people often make the most curious decisions," she said, though one wonders whether she fled from guilt or from discovery. "Do you suppose she knows something?" "I should be very surprised if she didn't," said Miss Marple. "Servants know everything except what to do with what they know." Inside the vicarage parlour, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lavender polish. Miss Marple sat while Mrs. Clement poured tea and continued in a voice half scandal, half concern. "Dr. Haydock hinted it was not robbery at all, you know. He says the blow was struck by someone standing very close, perhaps even facing her at first." "Oh, it's too dreadful." "Yes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Intimacy makes dreadful things possible. A stranger may threaten, but only a friend persuades you to turn your back." She sipped her tea, her mind sorting the fragments. Letters from London, a sealed envelope, a vanished maid, and a card depicting an old telephone. A device for summoning. Yet, what if the caller never truly called at all? What if the name, the Midnight Caller, was a story meant for the village to tell itself, while the truth slipped quietly into the shadows? At dusk, she returned home, pausing at her garden gate as the lamplighter passed. A wind stirred the elms, and she thought of Mrs. Cooper's voice, sharp, commanding, never quite content. People like that collected obedience, not affection, and it was affection, not obedience, that betrayed the most when withdrawn. Her front room was serene, the clock ticking like a polite observer. She set aside her hat and took up her knitting, though her thoughts were elsewhere. Somewhere, she felt, lay the person who had written that earlier letter, the one Mrs. Cooper had been pleased to receive. Someone who knew how to play upon an old grievance, and perhaps upon pride. If she could find the thread of that correspondence, she would find the hand that had guided everything else. The needles clicked softly as she worked. Outside, the church bell struck 8. A moment later, from somewhere along the high street, came the sudden trill of a telephone ringing, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the evening stillness. Miss Marple paused mid-stitch, her eyes lifting toward the window. It was not, perhaps, remarkable for a telephone to ring, but in a village that spoke of midnight callers, even an ordinary sound could send a chill through the heart of St. Mary Mead. The telephone's ring faded into the evening hush, leaving the air of St. Mary Mead heavy with its echo. Miss Marple, who rarely allowed herself the indulgence of superstition, nonetheless felt a curious shiver pass through her fingers. It was, she thought, like the echo of a truth one could almost grasp. Too faint to name, but too sharp to ignore. Moments later, there came a soft rap at her cottage door. She opened it to find Leonard Briggs standing awkwardly on her step, cap in hand, his face pale under the gaslight. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple," he began, voice low. "I didn't know who else to talk to. They've been saying things about me, about Mrs. Cooper." Miss Marple gestured him in at once, leading him to the small sitting room fragrant with lavender and the faint scent of toasted bread. "Sit down, my dear boy. A cup of tea does wonders for the nerves." Leonard obeyed, clasping his hands to still their trembling. "They say I was seen near her house that night, but I wasn't, I swear it. I walked past the green, yes, but I never went down Elm Street. It was late, near 11. He hesitated, eyes darting toward the window as though the elms themselves might be listening. "I just needed air." "And what was troubling you?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Daphne," he admitted, his voice rough. "We argued. I'd found out she'd been talking to Mrs. Cooper." The old woman liked to meddle. "Said she knew things about my family, things that would make Daphne think twice about me. Lies, all of it. But she liked to talk. She liked to see people squirm." Miss Marple poured tea with deliberate slowness. "Mrs. Cooper could be forthright. But tell me, Leonard, why do you suppose she said those things?" "I don't know. Maybe she thought she was helping, or maybe she enjoyed watching people fight." He looked down into his cup. "If I'd gone there that night, I might have said things I'd regret. But I didn't go. That's the truth." Miss Marple regarded him quietly. "The truth," she said, "is sometimes less about what one did and more about why one didn't." Leonard frowned, not understanding. She smiled faintly. "If you didn't go to Mrs. Cooper's, then who did? Someone who knew she was writing late, who could knock at the door without alarm. Someone she expected, or feared enough to admit regardless." He looked up sharply. Then it was someone she knew. "Most murders are very domestic," Miss Marple said softly, "and very inconvenient to the murderer." After Leonard left, she sat a long while in her chair, knitting untouched in her lap. The kettle hummed faintly on the stove, and outside the elm branches stirred against one another with a dry whisper. She thought of the telephone that had rung so insistently, and of the card left by Mrs. Cooper's body. The symbolism was crude, theatrical, and yet somehow familiar. People who wished to frighten often borrowed their effects from stories, and the village had already written half its own. But the real author, Miss Marple suspected, preferred a subtler hand. The next morning dawned grey, with a faint promise of rain. At breakfast, her maid Mary brought in the post, a single envelope, pale blue, addressed in a firm, slanted hand. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside was a note written in precise, even letters. "You seem to know too much about what does not concern you. Best to keep your pretty nose out of Elm Street matters, Miss Marple. A friend." Miss Marple read it twice, folded it neatly, and slipped it beneath her saucer. "Mary," she said calmly, "would you be so good as to tell the vicar I may call upon him this afternoon? I believe we must speak about the choir fund, and possibly about poison pen letters." By midday, the village was abuzz again. The postmistress had received a similar note, unsigned but unmistakable in tone. Loose tongues make for bad company. Mrs. Price Ridley too confessed to having one, though she mentioned it to Miss Hartnell first, which ensured the entire green heard within the hour. It was, Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction, exactly the sort of panic the writer intended to sow. At the vicarage, Reverend Clement frowned over the notes spread upon his desk. "This is beyond distasteful," he said. "First Mrs. Cooper's murder, now this nonsense. Slack will have a field day." "Quite," said Miss Marple. "But I wonder if he'll—" "Notice that the envelopes all bear the same type of paper. Cheap, but of a particular shade sold only at Mr. Carruthers's stationer in Much Benham, the kind of stationery used by typists and secretaries. Rather like Mrs. Phelps's, perhaps." The vicar blinked. "You mean her secretary?" The young blonde woman? Miss Larkin, yes, said Miss Marple. She has an excellent hand, very uniform, and she was new to the village. It is always difficult to gauge newcomers, especially those who watch and listen before they choose their friends. You think she wrote them? I think, said Miss Marple, that whoever wrote them has been watching closely since Mrs. Cooper died. Such letters test the waters. They measure who will talk and who will not. Mrs. Cooper, you see, knew things about others, but someone else knew things about her. The vicar's brow furrowed. You believe Mrs. Cooper was blackmailing someone? Or threatening too, Miss Marple said. She liked control, and control takes many forms. But she overestimated her advantage. She mistook silence for submission. They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Inspector Slack, looking harried. Miss Marple, Reverend, another development. The maid Elsie has turned up, or rather, been found. She's staying with her cousin in Much Benham, claims she left because she was frightened after seeing a man leaving Mrs. Cooper's cottage that night. A man, the vicar echoed. Yes, tall, city clothes, matches that earlier description. Said he carried something under his arm, a parcel, she thought. Slack rubbed his chin. She was too frightened to tell us before, but she said he looked angry. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. Ah, anger can be very deliberate, Inspector. Did she say which way he went? Toward the post road. We'll check the inn, see if anyone stayed over that night. Miss Marple rose. Do, please. And ask about the parcel. People rarely carry something to a house they don't mean to leave behind. When Slack departed, she lingered at the vicarage window, watching the drizzle settle into the hedges. The village seemed quieter now, as if it too were holding its breath. Somewhere among these respectable people was a story begun long before the fete, before the ink-stained desk, before the card on the floor. And like all stories, it depended not on what was shown, but what was carefully concealed. That evening, as twilight gathered once more, Miss Marple took out her small address book and found a number she had not dialed in years, a retired colonel who now managed a boarding house in London. She placed the call through the post office exchange, waiting as the faint clicks and hums bridged the distance. When his familiar voice came on the line, she said pleasantly, "Good evening, Colonel Bantry. You may think it an odd request, but I wonder, have you ever come across a gentleman by the name of Pike, or Pike-like, involved in business matters of a somewhat questionable kind?" The colonel chuckled softly, though his tone grew serious. Pike? Oh, yes. Miss Marple. I dare say I have. If it's the same man, he's no gentleman at all. A bit of a blackmailer, in fact. Disappeared a few weeks ago, owing money to half of London. You don't mean to tell me he's found his way to your village? Miss Marple smiled faintly into the receiver. It would appear, she said, that he may have found his way to Mrs. Cooper's study instead. And as she replaced the receiver, she thought, not for the first time, that wickedness never truly stayed in the cities. It merely learned to travel under quieter names. The next morning broke under a low, pewter sky, the kind that promised rain without ever committing to it. St. Mary Mead seemed to draw its shawl tighter, doors closing a little faster, curtains twitching a little sooner. The village had developed a nervous habit of glancing toward Elm Street, as though the very name might summon something unwholesome. Miss Marple, however, moved through it with her usual serenity, her mind quietly assembling the pieces that others had left scattered in fear or vanity. Inspector Slack arrived at her gate just after breakfast, his boots still wet from the lane. "You were right, Miss Marple," he said without preamble, his expression grim but grudgingly respectful. The man calling himself Pike was in the area, stayed at the Red Lion under the name of Mr. Peters, checked out the morning after the murder, left no forwarding address. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with quiet satisfaction. And the parcel he was seen carrying? A set of papers, apparently. The innkeeper remembers he guarded them like they were gold. We've not found them yet, but it seems he left with them intact. Then Mrs. Cooper gave him something, Miss Marple murmured. Or he took what she meant to keep. Slack nodded. We're still waiting on the London police to send word about him, but it fits with what you said. Blackmail. Perhaps Mrs. Cooper was mixed up in it. Maybe she tried to play his game and lost. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, she decided to change the rules. The inspector frowned. How do you mean? She may have refused to pay any longer, Miss Marple said. Blackmail thrives on silence, Inspector, but it dies when the victim begins to talk. If she threatened to expose him, she would have sealed her own fate. And yet, she trailed off, gazing past the garden hedge where a robin darted between branches. It troubles me, she went on quietly, that Mrs. Cooper was writing a letter when she died. To whom, do you suppose? We're working on that, Slack said. The handwriting on the sealed letters been compared with some we found in her bureau. Same paper, same pen. We'll open it with a witness this afternoon. Ah, Miss Marple said mildly. I think that will be most enlightening. Slack gave her a measuring look. You already have a notion, don't you? Miss Marple smiled, her knitting needles resting like twin wands on her lap. Only a sense of direction, Inspector. One never walks straight to the truth. It's more a matter of wandering into it politely. By the afternoon, the vicarage drawing room was the appointed place for the letter's opening. Present were Inspector Slack, Dr. Haydock, and Miss Marple, who had been invited, though one suspected her presence was less invitation than inevitability. The envelope was slit carefully, its contents removed. 2 sheets of neat handwriting, composed but hurried. Slack began to read aloud. My dear Leonard, he said, and paused. Well, that's interesting. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her face remained serene. My dear Leonard, Slack continued, I have thought it right to tell you the truth, since you must hear it from me rather than gossip. The man who has lately come to St. Mary Mead, Mr. Pike, is not, as he pretends, a family friend. He was once connected to your father's affairs in London and possesses certain letters that could be misused. I intend to buy them back, and this will put an end to his interference once and for all. You must not worry, though I suspect he may come to the house this evening to conclude the matter. I trust it will soon be behind us. Affectionately, Agnes Cooper. The room was very quiet when he finished. So, said Dr. Haydock slowly, she meant to meet him. She knew he would come. Miss Marple inclined her head. And she expected to succeed? Poor Mrs. Cooper, she always believed she could manage people by out-talking them. Then it's simple, Slack said briskly. She tried to buy the letters. There was an argument, and Pike, or Peters, killed her. We'll circulate his description. London will find him eventually. Miss Marple regarded him gently. I wonder if it is quite so simple. You see, Inspector, I think Mrs. Cooper did not fail in her bargain. I think she succeeded, and that was what killed her. He frowned. You mean someone else? Yes, Miss Marple said. Someone who discovered she had the letters, or feared she might use them. Mr. Pike may have taken her money and gone, but the danger remained with those papers, and the person who killed her, well, they would need to know she had them back in her possession. Dr. Haydock leaned forward. Then the parcel Pike carried away was likely empty, Miss Marple said quietly. A trick to make his departure look innocent. Slack's pencil froze over his notebook. Then who in the village would have wanted those papers? Miss Marple's answer came after a small pause. Someone connected to Leonard Briggs' father, perhaps. Someone who feared what might come to light if old business were discussed. And knew. Money matters, possibly. But gossip spreads like ivy. Once it touches one wall, it reaches all the others. There may be more than one person with cause to worry. Later that afternoon, as she left the vicarage, Miss Marple met Daphne Worsley walking quickly along the lane, her cheeks flushed and eyes rimmed with tears. The girl stopped when she saw her, struggling for composure. "Oh, Miss Marple," she burst out. "They're saying Leonard's father was mixed up in something dreadful in London years ago, that he stole money, that Mrs. Cooper knew and threatened to tell. It isn't true. It can't be. Leonard's nearly beside himself." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her arm. "People repeat what frightens them, my dear. It gives the fear somewhere to live outside themselves. But truth, in my experience, is usually much smaller and far less interesting." Daphne bit her lip. "He's gone to Elm Street. He said he had to see for himself. I tried to stop him." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her step quickened as she made her way down the lane. Elm Street lay in that uneasy hush again, the kind that falls before rain or revelation. Leonard stood before Mrs. Cooper's shuttered cottage, staring at the door as though it might speak. "She wrote to me," he said when he saw her. "The inspector showed me the letter. She thought she was helping. I hated her for it." "Hate is an untidy word," Miss Marple said softly. "It covers all manner of smaller things: shame, fear, confusion. I dare say Mrs. Cooper felt some of those herself." "She's dead because of it," Leonard said, "and it's my family's fault somehow." Miss Marple studied his face. "Your father's dealings in London are of no interest to me, but I imagine they are of great interest to someone else here. Tell me, did Mrs. Cooper ever mention showing those letters to anyone?" He hesitated, then nodded. "She said something about warning Mrs. Phelps, that she'd been taken in by the wrong sort of man before." Miss Marple's eyes lit with the faintest spark. "Mrs. Phelps," she said softly. "Yes, that would fit rather neatly, wouldn't it?" Leonard frowned. "I don't understand." "Perhaps not yet," Miss Marple murmured. "But you will." That night, long after the lamps had been extinguished and the drizzle turned to a whisper of rain, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched beside her. The village slept uneasily. Somewhere a dog barked once, then fell silent. She thought of Mrs. Cooper's blotted page, of a parcel perhaps never carried, of letters that could ruin reputations, and of one woman who had every reason to fear their contents. She folded her hands, her expression calm. "The next move," she whispered to herself, "will be hers." Morning came wet and restless, the rain settling into a steady patter that muffled the village sounds. Miss Marple sat by her window, with her teacup, watching the droplets gather on the glass and trail down in crooked lines. It was a morning for staying indoors, but St. Mary Mead seldom rested when mystery lingered among its hedges. The rain might wash the roads, but it would not quiet the tongues. She had already seen Mrs. Price Ridley's figure dart past with an umbrella at an angle better suited for eavesdropping than shelter. By midday, the entire green would know that Inspector Slack had returned from Much Benham with developments. That word villagers cherished like a new scandal. Miss Marple's kettle had barely cooled when the knock came. Slack stood on the step, rain glistening on his coat. "We've found something," he said without greeting. "Thought you'd like to hear it firsthand." "Mind if I come in?" "Not at all," she said, ushering him to the warmth of the hearth. "Tea, Inspector." "Please," he muttered, shaking off his hat. "We traced Pike's movements to London. Seems he pawned a lady's brooch 2 days before he turned up here, a gold one with the initials AC. He told the pawnbroker it was his aunt's, but the description matches Mrs. Cooper's exactly. My guess is she paid him in jewelry instead of cash. But here's where it gets interesting. Pike's been found." "Found?" "In a lodging house near Paddington," Slack said grimly. "Dead. Took a dose of something unpleasant. Maybe accidental, maybe not. But here's the queer part. He had no papers on him. No letters, no parcel, nothing. And the pawn ticket's gone." Miss Marple set the teapot down without sound. "So the papers, those letters Mrs. Cooper meant to recover, never left St. Mary Mead." "Exactly." Slack leaned forward. Someone here must have got to them before Pike left. Maybe the killer, maybe someone trying to protect themselves. Either way, that means the motive's right here under our noses." "Under our noses," Miss Marple repeated softly. "A most uncomfortable place for anything dangerous." Slack gave a short laugh. "I'll say this much, Miss Marple. You make these things sound neater than they are. My desk's full of suspects and not a one fits cleanly. The Major denies all knowledge. The Secretary says she's never even seen Pike. And Mrs. Phelps, well, she looks like she's about to faint every time I ask a question." "Mrs. Phelps," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, pouring the tea. "A woman with a very tidy life, everything in its place. She's the sort who notices fingerprints on the sugar tongs. And she has a husband who prefers his business dealings kept private, I think." Slack blinked. "You're suggesting Phelps is tied to Pike?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that Mrs. Cooper may have found herself holding letters that touched more than one life. Blackmail is a social disease, Inspector. It spreads faster than influenza. Sometimes the person being blackmailed is not the one who pays." Slack rubbed his temple. "If that's true, we'll need proof." "Yes," said Miss Marple, her tone mild. "Proof or behavior. The two are not so very different when one knows what to look for." When he had gone, the rain slackened, and Miss Marple decided upon a small errand to the post office. She wrapped her shawl and stepped into the damp lane. The puddles reflected the bent elms and the dull silver of the sky. As she passed the vicarage, she saw Daphne Worsley standing uncertainly by the gate. The girl's face was pale, her eyes swollen with tears. "Miss Marple," she said at once, "it's Leonard. He's gone to see Mrs. Phelps. He said he had to know what she told Mrs. Cooper about his father. I begged him not to go." "Then we must follow him," Miss Marple said calmly, gathering her skirt. They arrived at the Phelps residence just as voices rose from within, Leonard's raw with anger, and Mrs. Phelps sharp and trembling. Miss Marple motioned Daphne to remain outside and quietly entered through the open gate. The scene inside was strained but not violent. Leonard stood before the fireplace, fists clenched, while Mrs. Phelps sat rigid on the edge of her armchair, her expression torn between pride and terror. "You've no right to dig into things you don't understand," she was saying. "Mrs. Cooper had a cruel tongue, that's all. She liked to wound." "She told me my father stole money," Leonard said. "She said you could prove it, that you had letters." "I had nothing to do with her death," Mrs. Phelps cried. "I never saw those letters. She only hinted, just enough to frighten me. My husband, he's a proud man, Mr. Briggs. He couldn't bear disgrace. I thought if I ignored it, it would fade away." Miss Marple's quiet voice cut through the room. "Disgrace, Mrs. Phelps, has a way of staying in one's pocket until it's paid for." Both turned. Mrs. Phelps' hands twisted in her lap. "She had no reason to involve me. I only lent her money, small amounts for the church bazaar. But she knew about Richard's past. He told me years ago, before we married. A foolish mistake, no crime, just a debt that wasn't his to pay. Pike was his partner once, before the war. He must have kept those letters. And when Mrs. Cooper learned of them," Miss Marple said, "she saw an opportunity to play savior, perhaps even to profit a little from the exchange. She thought she could handle him," Mrs. Phelps whispered. "She said she'd buy the letters and burn them, but she wanted her due thanks, of course. Agnes never did charity without audience." "And you?" Mrs. Phelps' eyes filled. "I went to her that evening. I wanted to see the letters myself, to make sure they were destroyed, but she wouldn't let me in. She said I'd have them in the morning once Pike was gone. I swear that's all. When I heard later what had happened—" "You said nothing," Miss Marple finished gently. "Silence is often mistaken for innocence, Mrs. Phelps, but it is very rarely so." The woman broke into quiet sobs, her composure finally giving way. Leonard stood awkwardly, guilt and confusion warring across his face. Miss Marple moved toward the writing desk, her gaze sweeping over its tidy surface. "Mrs. Phelps," she said softly, "did you happen to receive one of those unpleasant anonymous letters the day after Mrs. Cooper's death?" The woman looked up sharply. "No. No, I didn't." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That's rather what I expected. The writer already knew you had nothing more to tell." She turned toward Leonard. "You must go home, my dear boy. There's little you can do tonight, but truth has a habit of growing restless when it's cornered. I expect it will show itself before long." Outside, the rain had stopped altogether, leaving the lane slick and glistening. Daphne came running to meet them, relief and worry mingling on her face. Leonard said little as they walked, though he paused once to look back toward the Phelps house. "She's hiding something," he muttered. "You saw it too." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Everyone hides something, Leonard. The trick is knowing who hides it for fear and who hides it for gain." That evening, as darkness settled over St. Mary Mead, a strange calm fell. The gossip quieted, the windows glowed faintly behind drawn curtains, and the church bell tolled the hour with weary insistence. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting slowly, her thoughts as methodical as her stitches. The truth, she felt, was now close enough to breathe on the back of her neck. Outside, a soft tapping came at her door. She opened it to find Mary, her maid, looking pale. "Beg pardon, ma'am," she whispered, "but there's been another note left at the vicarage gate. The same kind as before." Miss Marple took the folded paper and opened it under the lamplight. The writing was identical. Tidy, measured, but colder now. The past is better buried. Some graves are not worth reopening. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the words, and for the first time that night, her expression grew grave. "Ah," she said softly, "then our caller has not yet rung off." The note lay upon Miss Marple's table like an accusation, the ink still faintly glistening under the lamplight. The handwriting, neat and deliberate, bore a strange familiarity, not in the content, but in the rhythm of its strokes. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied it, her mind tracing the way each letter curved, the way the writer took care not to blot, not to betray haste. That sort of careful hand belonged to someone who valued composure above all else. And composure, Miss Marple knew well, was the first refuge of the guilty. She placed the note neatly in an envelope and rose. It was too late to call upon anyone, but the morning would do. For now, she would think, quietly, methodically, while the rain whispered against the windows. She had known all along that the blackmail had not ended with Mrs. Cooper's death. Someone had taken up the thread where Pike had dropped it, weaving the same pattern of fear and silence. But the tone of this last message was not the work of a stranger. It was written by someone who lived among them, someone confident enough to warn. And that meant they were growing nervous. The next morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the lanes washed clean and the hedges heavy with droplets. Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where Inspector Slack was conferring grimly with Reverend Clement. The inspector looked up as she entered, his expression suggesting both relief and resignation. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, "I was about to send for you. Seems there's been another little episode. Mrs. Phelps has vanished." Miss Marple's brows lifted, though her voice remained calm. "Vanished? Left the house before dawn," Slack said. "Told the maid she was visiting her sister in Bath. But no one's seen her at the station. Her husband claims she never mentioned going anywhere. Left a note for him, sounded hysterical. Something about not being able to live with what she knows." "That is unfortunate," Miss Marple said softly. "Guilt makes for poor travel companions." Slack exhaled sharply. "I'm inclined to think she's our murderer. Fits the pattern. She was involved with Pike, frightened of exposure, maybe thought she could solve it by silencing Mrs. Cooper. Then she starts panicking when things spiral out of control. The poison pen letters, this business of vanishing, it all points one way." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "Perhaps. But I wonder if it points quite as clearly as you think. You see, People who truly flee rarely announce it. They go quietly, even clumsily, without drama. But Mrs. Phelps, she was a woman who tidied everything, even her own confessions. I think she has gone to meet someone. Slack frowned. Meet who? That, said Miss Marple, depends on who most needs her silence. The vicar looked uneasy. Jane, you don't suppose she's in danger? Oh, yes, said Miss Marple mildly. I rather think she is. By mid-afternoon, the village was astir again. The Red Lion's landlord reported seeing a woman matching Mrs. Phelps' description speaking to a stranger near the coach road. Tall, wearing a dark coat, and carrying a small black case. The man had guided her toward the woods beyond the mill. When Slack's men searched the area, they found only footprints, hers stopping abruptly at the edge of the river path. The man's continued back toward the village. The inspector swore softly. Could be Pike's accomplice. Maybe he's still around. Or maybe it's this mysterious caller playing games. Miss Marple said nothing. She stood at the edge of the muddy path, gazing at the ground where the prints vanished. The soil was soft, the water close. A person could disappear quickly here, and so could evidence, but something about the pattern of the steps struck her as odd. The woman's prints were close together, hesitant. The man's were longer, deeper, as though he'd returned alone, walking faster, heavier. And then she noticed it, the faint impression of a walking stick near the final mark. Inspector, she said quietly, does Major Withers still use his cane? I believe he claimed an old injury, did he not? Slack straightened. The Major? He said he was home all that night, and he's no murderer. Loud, yes, but not the sort for subtle business like this. Miss Marple gave a small smile. My dear Inspector, subtlety is not always born of intellect. Sometimes it is merely vanity wishing to conceal its hand. That evening, Miss Marple invited the Major to tea. He arrived punctually, moustache brushed to its fullest authority, his gait as deliberate as ever. Dashed unpleasant business, Miss Marple, he declared. Can't make head or tail of it. Poor woman. Couldn't stand the shame, I dare say. Nerves, you know. Never did have much constitution. Miss Marple poured his tea. And yet one might say she had remarkable endurance. Given her circumstances, it takes a strong stomach to live with fear for so long. The Major coughed into his cup. Yes, well, that's women for you. Always carrying things too far. Cooper, too, she made trouble where there was none. You mark my words, she probably brought it on herself. Perhaps, Miss Marple said mildly. But I've always thought it unwise to assume misfortune chooses its victims by temperament. You knew her well, didn't you? The Major shifted in his seat. Knew her enough. Committee work, that sort of thing. She was always poking into other people's affairs. I kept my distance. I imagine that was wise, said Miss Marple, her tone light. Still, she did speak to you the afternoon before she died. About money matters, I think. Mrs. Price Ridley said she overheard part of it by the tombola. The Major froze, spoon half raised. Money matters? What nonsense. Well, she might have mentioned something trivial. Donations for the fete. I can't recall. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. Then perhaps I've been misinformed. But it's curious, isn't it, how people forget small conversations until they are reminded of them in print. He frowned. In print? She reached into her knitting bag and drew out the latest anonymous note, still folded. This arrived last night. The same stationery as Mrs. Cooper used to write her committee correspondence. I found it odd that the ink blot near the lower margin matches the pattern left by a pen that leaks slightly, rather like the one you used at the parish meeting last month. It leaves a little crescent stain on the left side of the nib. The Major's face paled beneath his ruddy complexion. Good heavens, woman, what are you implying? Miss Marple's eyes were serene. Nothing at all, Major, only that people sometimes write too carefully when they wish to appear calm. It alters the shape of their letters. The difference between honesty and performance, I suppose. He rose abruptly, muttering something about the lateness of the hour. When he reached for his hat, his hand trembled. "You'll excuse me, Miss Marple. I'm not myself tonight." "Quite understandable," she said pleasantly. "Grief affects us all differently. Do take care near the bridge. The rain has made the boards slippery." After he had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, the room filled with the faint ticking of the clock. She was not certain whether the Major would run or fight, but she knew he would do one of the two before morning, and whichever he chose, the truth would follow close behind. When the clock struck 11, the phone rang, sharp, startling, echoing through the little cottage. Miss Marple lifted the receiver. A voice, low and urgent, spoke only 4 words before the line went dead. "He's gone to the river." She replaced the receiver slowly, her eyes narrowing. "Yes," she murmured to the empty room. "I rather thought he might." The night air was sharp and damp when Miss Marple stepped out into the lane, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders. The moon, veiled by drifting cloud, cast a wan silver light over the hedges, and the village lay hushed except for the whisper of water from the direction of the river. She moved slowly, carefully, her small figure almost indistinguishable from the shadows, yet every sense alert. The voice on the telephone, low, urgent, unmistakably feminine, still echoed in her ears. "He's gone to the river." She did not need to guess who he was. Major Withers had been crumbling behind his bluster since the moment she'd shown him that letter. Pride and guilt seldom made comfortable bedfellows, and she suspected both had driven him toward some final, desperate act. The river was a quiet place to disappear. But Miss Marple knew that desperate men rarely went quietly. They left ripples, even in death. As she reached the small bridge beyond the mill, she saw a glimmer of movement below, the faintest reflection of a lantern wavering on the black water. 2 figures stood by the bank, one tall and stooped, the other smaller, holding the light. Miss Marple stopped just short of the railing, straining to hear. "You shouldn't have come," the man's voice muttered, tight, frayed, unmistakably Major Withers's. "I had to," came the reply. A woman's voice, soft, frightened, and trembling slightly. Miss Marple recognized it at once as Mrs. Phelps. "You promised you'd destroy them. You said it was over." "I did destroy them," Withers hissed. "For God's sake, what good? Would it do me to keep those damned letters? But they found Pike, didn't they? And if he talked before he died, if the police—" "They'll hang you," she whispered. "You killed her." The Major gave a low, strangled laugh. "She forced my hand. I went there to take the letters. Nothing more. She said she'd keep them for safety, that she'd send them to London if I didn't confess. Always talking, always threatening. I only meant to frighten her. One moment she was standing, the next she was on the floor, bleeding. It was the candle holder. I swear I didn't." Mrs. Phelps' sob cut through his words. "Then it's true. Oh, what have we done?" "We," Miss Marple thought grimly. So there it was, the partnership of silence revealed at last. Withers stepped closer to her. "Listen to me, you foolish woman. No one needs to know you were involved. You said nothing before, you'll say nothing now. Go back to your husband, to your spotless house, and leave me to my choices." "I can't," she said, her voice breaking. "The letters, they'll find them." "What letters?" "I hid them," she whispered. "After you told me what you'd done, I couldn't burn them. They're locked in the church vestry box, the one the vicar never opens. I thought if anything happened, they would prove I didn't kill her." There was a silence then, heavy, stretching. Miss Marple gripped the railing, her pulse steady but quickened. The Major's voice came again, hoarse and trembling. "You damned fool! You've doomed us both!" He lunged forward, The lantern dropped, extinguishing itself in the mud with a hiss. For an instant, all was blackness and chaos. The scuffle of feet, the thud of bodies struggling, and then the sickening sound of something heavy striking water. Miss Marple hurried down the bank, her small shoes sinking into the damp earth. When she reached the edge, she saw the lantern's faint glow flickering where it floated against a branch. Mrs. Phelps knelt in the mud, gasping, clutching her arm. "He slipped," she cried breathlessly. "I tried to stop him, but he slipped." "Don't move," Miss Marple said firmly, kneeling beside her. The Major's body had vanished beneath the slow-moving current, though a few bubbles still broke the surface where he had fallen. "You mustn't go near the edge. The ground gives way there." The woman was shaking violently. "It wasn't meant to be like this. None of it was. He said he'd take the blame, but I couldn't live with it. The letters—" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "The letters are safe for now, and soon so will you be. But we must tell Inspector Slack the truth before the river carries away more than one life." By dawn, the body was found several yards downstream, lodged against the roots of an alder tree. Slack arrived before the light had properly risen, his face drawn but composed. "So it's finished then," he said quietly, after hearing Miss Marple's account. "The Major killed Mrs. Cooper, and he's paid for it. Mrs. Phelps was helping him cover it up. Frightened into silence, no doubt." Miss Marple looked down at the still water, her expression unreadable. "Yes, Inspector," she said softly, "though I think it was guilt, not fear, that kept her silent. Fear fades with time. Guilt, you see, festers." Slack glanced toward the constables leading Mrs. Phelps away. "You've done it again, Miss Marple. I don't know how you see these things so clearly." She gave a faint smile. "Experience, Inspector. In the village, one sees every sort of tragedy in miniature. A quarrel over a gate, a whisper at a tea party. It all comes to the same end, if pride and shame get the better of people." He nodded slowly, looking down the river. "I suppose you'll say it's human nature." "It always is," she replied. "That and the curious belief that one can tidy away consequences as easily as one tidies a drawing room." When Slack had gone, Miss Marple lingered by the bridge, the morning light glinting faintly on the water. She thought of Mrs. Cooper, bossy, vain, meddlesome, yet perhaps not deserving of so grim a fate. She thought, too, of Mrs. Phelps, whose respectability had been her undoing, and of Major Withers, whose pride had carried him where courage could not. Back at her cottage, she set the kettle on to boil and unfolded her knitting once more. It was a new piece, soft grey wool, delicate and unassuming, the kind one could easily overlook. As her needles began their rhythmic clicking, she found herself murmuring, half to herself, half to the quiet room. People do so hate being found out, and yet, somehow, the truth always finds its way to the surface, much like a body in the river. The clock chimed 8. Outside, the elms stood tall and still once more, their reflections unbroken in the morning calm. St. Mary Mead would awaken soon, its gossip, its routine, its gentle pretense of peace. And somewhere beyond the murmuring hedges, a telephone rang again, this time ordinary, harmless, only the vicarage line being tested. But for Miss Marple, that sound would always carry an echo, faint but enduring, the call that began it all, and the truth that answered back. The days following the discovery of the river passed quietly, though not peacefully. In St. Mary Mead, quiet was rarely a sign of calm. It was the silence of people digesting scandal, adjusting their morals to accommodate gossip. Curtains fluttered a little too long when one walked by, and conversations hushed abruptly when doors opened. The official verdict, printed discreetly in the Kingsbridge Gazette, was a concise summary of shame. Major Harold Withers, in a state of emotional distress, is believed to have taken his own life following the murder of Mrs. Agnes Cooper. Owing to evidence supplied by local authorities, the matter is now considered closed. But Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to recognize the difference between closure and conclusion, did not believe the matter entirely settled. The inspector had accepted her account with the weary satisfaction of a man eager for paperwork to end, yet something about the pattern of events remained untidy in her mind. It was not the murder itself. She had seen enough of those, in essence, to understand them, but the final shape of guilt. It felt too neat, too balanced, as if someone had tidied it up for public consumption. And Miss Marple distrusted tidiness, especially in matters of human behavior. On the third morning, she was in her garden pruning the roses when Dr. Haydock's car drew up at her gate. He emerged, hat in hand, his genial face clouded. "You'll forgive me for disturbing your horticulture, Miss Marple," he said, "but I wanted your opinion on something, not medical, mind you, though it may touch the nerves." "Opinions," Miss Marple said mildly, "are rather like cats, Doctor. One must be sure which house they belong to before allowing them indoors." He smiled faintly. "Then I'll risk mine first. I saw Mrs. Phelps this morning at the jail. Slack asked me to assess her. He's not cruel, but he does like his reports tidy. She's not ill precisely, but she's frightened. And oddly so. Not of the law, not even of her husband's disappointment. Of something else." Miss Marple snipped a small bud and glanced up. "Did she say of what?" "Of the river," said Haydock, lowering his voice. "She keeps muttering that he'll come back, that he knows. I thought at first it was guilt talking, but it isn't hysteria. It's a genuine conviction." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Fear takes peculiar shapes, but perhaps she has reason. Major Withers, after all, has not entirely vanished. His effects, for instance. Has anyone examined them closely?" "Slack's men cleared the house," said Haydock. "A few papers, an army revolver, nothing interesting. The rest has been sealed until probate." "And his walking stick?" Haydock blinked. "You think that matters?" "It left a mark," Miss Marple said softly. "By the riverbank. I wonder if it might leave another." That afternoon she took a slow walk toward Elm Street, ostensibly to deliver wool to Mrs. Price Ridley, who had been knitting with unusual speed since the scandal began. The lane was quiet now, the Cooper cottage still shuttered, its air of reproach softened by rain and time. Yet as Miss Marple passed, she noticed a faint scuff on the doorstep, a mark that might have been left by the constables or by someone returning in secret. It was fresh, she thought, too fresh for neglect. She continued to the Phelps residence, where the maid, white-faced and eager to talk, admitted her readily. "Madam's husband's away in town," she confided in a whisper. "Left this morning, and I swear someone's been tapping at the back door since dark last night. I heard it clear as church bells." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window. The garden beyond was small and tidy, the sort where no weed dared intrude. Yet one flower pot by the back step had been shifted slightly, leaving a clean square of stone beneath it. She stepped closer. Beneath the disturbed soil, something faintly metallic caught the light. "May I borrow your trowel, my dear?" she asked pleasantly. A moment later, she drew out a small silver case, damp and smudged. Inside, carefully folded, was a strip of paper, the same blue stationery used in the poison pen letters. The handwriting, however, was different. Heavier, masculine, uneven. "You've made a mistake. I told you to keep quiet. If they find the letters, you'll hang for both of us. I'll be in touch." Miss Marple read it twice before closing the case. "Ah," she murmured. "Then perhaps the river didn't carry everything away." She left the house as calmly as she had entered, though her mind was racing. The note changed everything. Major Withers had not written it. The tone was too cold, too coercive. And yet, the reference to both of us suggested he was not working alone. Someone else had been part of the blackmail from the beginning, perhaps even before Pike appeared. Someone clever enough to survive in the shadows and foolish enough to think themselves safe once others were dead. That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicarage. The Reverend Clement and his wife received her warmly, though Mrs. Clement's curiosity was barely disguised. "You've heard, of course," she began at once, "about the dreadful noise last night near the Phelps garden. Mrs. Price Ridley insists it was a ghost. I told her she ought to stop reading penny thrillers, but she swore she saw a light moving along the hedge." Miss Marple stirred her tea absently. "Perhaps not a ghost. Fear makes one see what one expects. If someone returned to fetch something they'd hidden, a lantern might easily seem supernatural." The vicar looked over his spectacles. "Jane, you don't mean someone was there last night?" "I mean," said Miss Marple, "that whoever wrote to Mrs. Phelps believes she still holds something dangerous, and I suspect they will try again if they think the house unwatched." "Then we must inform Slack," said the vicar at once. "Oh, certainly," Miss Marple agreed. "But quietly. He will be here soon enough, I think." Indeed, not an hour later, Inspector Slack arrived, summoned by the vicar's discreet telephone call. Miss Marple handed him the silver case and letter, explaining where she had found them. He read the note twice, his brows knitting tighter. "So Withers had an accomplice," he said. "Blast it all, I should have known. Any idea who?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Only that the writer had knowledge of both the letters and the hiding place. In the church vestry. Few people would know of that, save those who assist with church records or repairs." "The vestry," Slack muttered. "That's old Mr. Clegg, the caretaker." "Mr. Clegg," Miss Marple repeated softly. "A devoted man, very punctual, and yet he took a sudden holiday the day after Mrs. Cooper's death. You'll find he returned this morning, I dare say. Punctual people cannot bear to be late forever." Slack stared at her, then nodded grimly. "We'll have him in for questioning." When he left, Miss Marple sat back, feeling the slow satisfaction of order returning to chaos. She did not think Mr. Clegg capable of violence. He was the sort who obeyed rather than struck, but she suspected he had been the silent hand behind the blackmail, the keeper of letters and secrets. Mrs. Cooper's meddling had upset his balance, Withers's panic had sealed their doom, and Mrs. Phelps had merely been the final pawn in their little game. Outside, the church bell began to toll, low and steady. Miss Marple listened to it, her expression thoughtful. Human nature, she reflected, was much like that bell, reliable in its frailties, predictable in its tone. No matter how quietly people sinned, their echoes always returned to be heard. And in St. Mary Mead, where even whispers carried, no secret ever stayed buried for long. The following morning dawned with a brittle chill that promised frost, the kind that made every sound seem unnaturally sharp. The elms along the lane stood dark and motionless, their bare branches etched against a pale sky. In St. Mary Mead, such weather usually meant gossip would be conducted indoors, but that morning there was little talk at all. Something had changed in the air, not fear this time, but expectation, as though the village itself knew that the final piece of some puzzle was about to fall into place. Miss Marple, who had slept lightly, rose early and lit her fire. She had spent much of the night thinking, not of Mrs. Cooper or even of poor Mrs. Phelps, but of Mr. Clegg, the quiet caretaker whose absence had seemed, until now, the most ordinary thing in the world. Ordinary things, she had learned long ago, were often the best disguises for wickedness. By 9:30, Inspector Slack's motor car rumbled past her cottage, bound for the church. She took her shawl and followed on foot, knowing he would not object to her presence when the time came. The churchyard was damp and still, the grass glistening with dew. Inside, the smell of stone and polish mingled with something faintly metallic, as though the air itself remembered the secrets hidden within its walls. Mr. Clegg was there already, polishing the brass candlesticks with his usual careful attention. He looked up as they entered, his small eyes blinking in the gloom. "Good morning, Inspector. Miss Marple." His tone was even, but his hands tightened ever so slightly on the cloth. "Morning, Clegg," Slack said, nodding. Got a few questions for you. Just routine, you understand. About the vestry. The vestry? The man's voice was mild, but there was a pause before he continued. I keep it locked, same as always. Only the vicar and I have keys. Yes, said Slack, about that. We've reason to believe some papers belonging to Mrs. Cooper were kept there. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Clegg's hands resumed their slow, steady motion over the candlestick. Papers, you say? Can't say as I do. People bring all sorts to the church. Flowers, hymn sheets, old prayer books. I don't keep track of them all. Miss Marple watched him quietly. His face was still, almost too still, the sort of expression worn by those who have practiced calmness as a habit. I dare say, she said gently, though one imagines it would be rather difficult not to notice when something out of the ordinary is placed in your care, especially if it was entrusted to you personally. He stopped polishing. Entrusted to me? Yes, she continued. I believe Mrs. Cooper asked you to keep a packet safe some weeks ago. Letters, perhaps. She would have said it was for the vicar's eyes only. And you, being a conscientious man, agreed. But later, when the letters' value became apparent, you realized they were worth more than duty could offer. Clegg turned then, his pale face taut. That's a cruel thing to say, Miss Marple. Cruelty has nothing to do with it, she said softly. It's only truth, Mr. Clegg. You took the letters. Perhaps you didn't mean harm at first. Perhaps you thought you could use them to settle an old debt or right a wrong. But then Pike came back into the picture, didn't he? He must have recognized you from London, his old clerk, dismissed for irregularities in accounts. He would have known exactly how to handle you. Slack stepped forward. That true, Clegg? The caretaker's lips pressed together. I did a bit of work for Pike years ago, he said slowly. Nothing dishonest, just numbers. But he had a way of keeping people under his thumb. When he came here, I thought he'd ruin me again. Said if I didn't help him, he'd tell the vicar what I'd done. So yes, I gave him what he wanted. Mrs. Cooper's letters. But then she started asking questions, and Pike got nervous. He said we'd both hang if the truth came out. And when Pike died? Miss Marple asked. Clegg looked down at his hands. I thought it was over, I swear it, but then the inspector came asking about the river, and Mrs. Phelps, poor woman, started hinting she'd hidden copies of the letters. I panicked. I thought if I could get them back before anyone saw, I'd be free. You wrote to her, Miss Marple said. You told her to stay quiet, and when she hid them in the vestry, you went back last night to fetch them. That's why the lantern was seen in the garden. Clegg's shoulders sagged. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I only wanted to burn them. But it's too late now, isn't it? Slack's voice was brisk but not unkind. I'm afraid it is. You'll have to come with me, Clegg. As the constable led the man away, Miss Marple turned toward the altar. The church was very still again, the kind of stillness that comes only after confession. Yet she could not help feeling a trace of sorrow. Clegg had been no monster, only an ordinary man tempted by the illusion of control. Most evil, she reflected, was not born from malice, but from the small, desperate wish to tidy one's own mistakes without consequence. Later that afternoon, she sat with Inspector Slack in the vicarage parlor, a pot of tea between them. He looked weary but content, the air of a man whose puzzle had finally resolved itself. I'll hand it to you, Miss Marple, he said. You see things the rest of us would never notice. I'd have taken Clegg for the most harmless soul alive. Oh, he was, she said mildly. Harmless until fear took hold of him. It's a very corrupting thing, fear. Makes honest people do dishonest things and foolish people. Well, desperate ones too. Slack nodded slowly. Still, it's a pity. You'd think after all this, St. Mary Mead would keep out of trouble for a while. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, I shouldn't count on it, Inspector. Villagers are like people. They settle for a bit, then begin to stir again. And when they do, there's always something interesting beneath the surface. That evening, as twilight folded itself over the village, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting in the fading light. The elms along the street stood quiet, their reflections dark against the glass. From the church, faint bells tolled the hour, steady and clear. She paused a moment, listening, then laid her knitting aside. It was all over now. The midnight caller, the whispered letters, the fear that had crept so slyly through St. Mary Mead. The village would heal, as it always did, in gossip and tea and the comfort of routine. Yet Miss Marple knew that beneath its polite veneer, the human heart would continue its quiet, imperfect rhythms, loving, lying, hoping, fearing. And somewhere, sooner or later, another small tragedy would unfold, as natural and as inevitable as the falling of dusk. She smiled faintly, folded her hands in her lap, and whispered to the empty room, "Ah, but what strange creatures we are, so eager to hide what is worst in us, and yet so certain that no one will ever notice." Outside, the first stars trembled into view above Elm Street, and the village of St. Mary Mead, seemingly at peace, drifted back into its familiar, watchful calm. The following Sunday dawned bright and clear, as if the village itself had been scrubbed clean by the passing storm of scandal. The church bells rang cheerfully, and the familiar trickle of parishioners along the lane resumed. Hats straightened, gloves pulled on, faces eager to appear untroubled once more. St. Mary Mead, with its extraordinary talent for self-restoration, was already stitching its composure back together. Yet beneath the polite smiles and murmured greetings, there lingered the faint unease that accompanies any tragedy too close to home. Miss Marple walked to the service as she always did, her pace measured, her eyes taking in everything. She greeted Mrs. Price Ridley, who was already whispering to Mrs. Bantry about the dreadful business, and nodded kindly to Leonard Briggs and Daphne Worsley, who sat together near the front, their young faces solemn but hopeful. Even Mrs. Phelps was there, her husband's arm firm around her shoulders, a quiet gesture of forgiveness that spoke louder than any sermon could. Afterward, when the congregation spilled into the sunlit churchyard, Inspector Slack found Miss Marple standing beside the old yew tree, admiring the blossoms. "Well," he said, exhaling deeply, "that's the end of it, I suppose? The papers are filed, Clegg's confessed, and the vicar's happy enough to call it divine justice." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'm glad he finds comfort in the phrasing, though I rather think it was human nature, not providence, that brought the matter to a close." Slack tilted his head. "Meaning? Meaning that poor Clegg didn't act entirely alone," she said gently. "Oh, he believed he did, and his confession was sincere enough. But even honesty can be incomplete when it rests on fear. You see, Inspector, he was guided rather cleverly. Manipulated, one might say." Slack frowned. "By who?" Miss Marple turned toward the church door, where Mr. Phelps was helping his wife into her shawl. "By someone who understood both his weakness and his loyalty. Mrs. Phelps was not entirely the trembling victim we all thought her to be. She may not have struck the fatal blow, but she set every other piece in motion." Slack stared at her. "You're not suggesting—" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said softly. She knew Pike was returning long before he arrived. Her husband's business dealings in London were more compromised than she ever admitted, and she feared exposure. So she wrote to Pike first, under another name, of course, and offered payment to destroy the letters. But Pike, being what he was, chose blackmail instead. When Mrs. Cooper learned of it and tried to intervene, Mrs. Phelps saw her chance to end both threats at once. She told Major Withers where Mrs. Cooper kept the letters, knowing full well that his pride and temper would lead to violence. All she needed afterward was to keep him, and then Clegg, quiet. Slack's eyes widened. "That's a devilish notion." "It's also a very tidy one," Miss Marple said. She played on their guilt, their sense of duty, their need to be forgiven. Poor Clegg thought he was protecting her when he destroyed the last of the letters. And now she stands there, a picture of fragile redemption, while the truth rests comfortably behind her husband's respectability. The inspector gave a long, low whistle. "You're sure of this?" "As sure as one can be without evidence," she replied serenely. "And since neither of us intends to ruin what peace remains, I imagine it will stay that way." Slack rubbed his chin, torn between frustration and admiration. "You've a mind like a steel trap, Miss Marple. But I'll say this much. You're kinder than I'd be, letting her walk free after all that." Miss Marple's smile deepened, though her eyes were distant. "Kindness, Inspector, is sometimes the only justice left when truth has done all it can. Mrs. Phelps will live her punishment every day. The hardest prisons, I find, are built of conscience." They parted at the gate, the inspector heading toward his car, while Miss Marple turned back toward her cottage. The afternoon light lay soft across the village, washing every rooftop and hedge in gold. Children played by the green, laughter echoing through the still air, and a milk cart rattled lazily down the lane. To any casual eye, St. Mary Mead looked as innocent as ever. But Miss Marple knew better. Beneath its charming surface, life here ran on small deceits, quiet ambitions, and the eternal tangle of hearts, a reflection, she thought, of the world itself in miniature. At home, she set her kettle on the stove and laid out her teacup. Her knitting waited by the chair, the unfinished grey shawl folded neatly on her lap. She sat for a moment, gazing out the window at the elm-lined street that had witnessed so much. The wind stirred the branches gently, and somewhere in the distance, a door closed softly, like the final page of a book. She sipped her tea and spoke aloud, her tone light but thoughtful. "It is a curious thing, this business of murder. One sees it dressed in passion or greed or desperation, but at its root, it's always the same, the fear of being known for what one truly is." Her eyes drifted to the mantel where a small clock ticked steadily on. "Still," she murmured, "truth, like time, has a way of keeping perfect rhythm." Outside, the first evening star appeared, trembling faintly in the blue. St. Mary Mead exhaled into stillness once more, its calm restored, its secrets, at least for now, laid to rest. And in her quiet cottage, Miss Marple smiled to herself, the faintest glimmer of amusement in her eyes. For she knew, as surely as the sun would rise again, that somewhere nearby, human folly was already beginning to stir, waiting patiently for her next cup of tea and her next quiet observation of the curious, unchanging nature of mankind.